You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Stephen Aryan.
Today's episode is sponsored by editor Ellen Campbell. Authors, if you are looking for someone to help shape your words into what you originally intended them to be, Ellen can help you do that. Ellen is one of the most sought-after indie editors out today, and she is one of the best. I've used her. So many other people in the community have used her. There's a link to her website in the show notes. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Guys, I am really excited today to have my friend Stephen Aryan back on the show. He was with us last year, and we were talking about the Battle Mage series, and he told us this great news about a new series that he was working on. Well, book 2 of that series, Magefall, The Age of the Dread, book 2 is out, and we've been chatting before we started recording, and he was telling me all about book 3 that he's working on. So we're going to talk all about that stuff today. But I'm a huge fan of Stephen. I'm a huge fan of his work, and I'm glad to call him a friend. Welcome back to the show, Stephen.
Thanks, Hank. Good to be back.
Excellent. So the new book, Magefall, Age of the Dread, book 2,
Yes.
is out. Tell us a little bit of, well, first off, what you've been doing this last year. When we last talked, you were writing, full time. You were working, some, juggling those two things. Has life gotten any slower for you in the meantime?
I'd like to say it has, but it really hasn't. It seems to be like people say, by this time it must be easier to write like your 5th or 6th book, and it's just not. It's really not. And I think I'd probably worry if it was to some degree, because it would mean I wasn't putting as much effort in, and I wasn't worried about the book, because every book that I write, I have this phase. I now know it comes up, so I'm not as worried, but I get about 40 or 50,000 words into the book, and then I think, this is the worst thing I've ever written. I'm wasting my time. This is awful. Everyone's going to hate it. What am I doing? And this lasts for about 4 or 5 days, but I just keep chugging on, doing the words, moving forward. And after a while, it fades, and I look back and I go, oh, okay, that's not too bad. I kind of like that bit. Okay, maybe I'm not the worst writer in history. Maybe there's something here. And then I move on. So since we last spoke, book 4 came out. I was editing book 5. That's just come out. And I'm now working on the first full edit of book 6, which is due next year. So, busy as ever.
I wonder if plumbers go through that. Do they wake up in the morning and go, oh God, I'm the worst plumber that has ever lived. I didn't set a pipe right, and someone's, got a fountain in their garage right now.
Familiar story.
Yeah, familiar. Yeah. This is just me working through my issues right now.
Yeah.
But artists, writers especially, I think, we all go through that. It doesn't matter how much work you have out there. There's just some days you go, I'm a complete fraud. This is not actually happening to me. One day, when book 12 is out, they're going to go, Hank had no idea what he was doing. Why have we bought his books heretofore? And so the more work you put out, it's one of those things that, maybe it's humility. I like to think that it's a self-preservation humility, that kicks in. But maybe it's just human nature that we just don't believe our own stories, sometimes. And it doesn't matter how much success you've had.
It's true. And you're also only as good as your last book. So
it's true.
You look back and you think, that was really good. And you look at the current work in progress, you think, oh man, I'm really going to have to step it up. But you can't just keep going bigger. You have to go in a different direction or do something new, or, you got to constantly stretch yourself. I guess that's it, because after 6 books and a novella in the same world, I'm ready for something different. I'm ready to explore a totally new world. And that's what I'm doing now. And that's stretching me because I don't have that familiarity. I don't have all of the comfortable things that I've set up with, the countries and the races and the magic system. It's totally brand new. So on the one hand, it's really exciting because I can make up a whole bunch of new stuff. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, oh yeah, but what if this is awful?
Yeah, there's a certain level of comfort that comes with a pre-existing world. I've built this thing. People like it. People like what I'm doing here. Therefore, the next book comes with a little bit of built-in, built-in expectations, maybe. And starting a new series or a new world is kind of like being a debut author all over again, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it works in some other ways as well, because if somebody picked up like the first book and they go, yeah, that's not for me, and then you do something completely different, they might go, okay, I'll give that another try. I mean, some of my favorite authors, I've read one of their series, the first book, and thought, yeah, I'm not really keen on that. And then someone else said, oh, try this other series. It's really good, by the same guy. And I have. And it's been really, really good. And I've got into it and I've burned through the series where, it really depends. There is that danger that if you write within the same world all of the time, it can be too comfortable for you and the readers can get too familiar and then they get kind of more ownership than normal and all this kind of problems can build up. But if you keep changing directions and testing yourself, and maybe you'll reach new audiences that you didn't have before.
Well, speaking of your 6th book, you're working on your 6th book,
yes.
That will be out next year, and a novella. Did you ever see this world being this in depth? Did you ever imagine there were this many stories that you could tell in this world from the beginning?
Probably not from the beginning. When I first started, it was I'd written a short story, and then I wanted to explore the character when they were much younger, and it was from there that the first kind of trilogy developed. And it was only as I was coming to the end of that first trilogy I started to turn my mind to, well, what am I going to do next? And although the first sort of 3 books wraps up the main story, it left a lot of things unanswered. There was still a lot of the world that hadn't been explored. There was a lot of problems that had kind of set up and evolved. And you know how in the old Star Trek show, like after 45 minutes, they kind of push the reset button and everything goes back to normal. I thought, okay, most modern fantasy books don't do that anymore. And so I thought, if I did come back to this world, I can't go back to square one. I have to start from where I left off with all of the problems that I've just created for myself. So that was a challenge in itself. So to begin with, no, I never thought I'd get this far. But now that I'm coming to the end of this trilogy, I definitely want a break from this world. But there are still ideas bubbling under that I'm scribbling down, and never say never. But right now, I'm not ready to write any more books in this world.
Well, let's talk the practicality just a minute. So you've got your first book, Battle Mage, was a game changer for me when I discovered that book. I was like, man, this is so cool. What a great kind of mashup of tropes and genre, and I just absolutely loved it. And you write the book, the publisher obviously likes it, and they say, let's write 3 of these books. And so you get to the end of that trilogy, and like you said, you leave some things unresolved. There are some, more questions that can be answered. It's a complete trilogy, and you can be completely satisfied with that. But there are obviously more things that you can do with it. How do you get invited to write another trilogy extending this universe and these stories? Is that something that you approach the publisher with? Do they say, "Hey, Steve, this is pretty good. Can we keep going?" Like how does that work?
So when I was getting towards the end of the 3rd book, and I think it was just coming out, I was talking to my agent, and she sort of said to me, what ideas have you got next? And I presented her with a couple of alternatives. I said, there's this other thing I want to do that's quite different, or maybe I do something more fantasy. I was possibly thinking of doing like a science fiction book or something. And this was just talking to my agent, and she said, okay, well, in terms of the readers out there, my first 3 books came out within 12 months. So for them, I'm a brand new kind of fantasy author. For me to suddenly go off and do something completely different, that's kind of probably not a good move. So she said, staying with fantasy is probably the best idea for now until you're a bit more established. And I thought, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then I chatted through different ideas with her. And then we spoke to the publisher and they said, well, we'd like something more in this world, again, because it's been popular and people have enjoyed it. So I had some ideas rattling around and I kind of pulled them together and worked on them and then started drafting up the first book and went back to them a few months later and showed that to them. And my ideas for 2 and 3 were pretty thin at that point. but they knew I could deliver. They knew I could deliver on time, and I did it to my deadlines. And in fact, I've beaten all of my deadlines for book 2 and 3. I've been so far ahead of them. So it was a kind of a discussion there again with my agent, and then later on with my editor at Orbit Books.
Let's talk about deadlines for just a minute, since you brought it up. There are a lot of fantasy authors that are beloved by their readers, and because of that love for the writer and for the stories that they've created, there can a lot of times be animosity that builds between readers and writers because those books and series maybe don't come as fast as readers would like. Yeah. And while we do not want to foster this kind of mob mentality where people just harangue authors to the point that you can't live up to the hype. I don't think that's healthy at all. But also, there's a certain social contract that happens, especially when you write a series and you get people hooked and you say, okay, the next story is coming in a certain amount of time. And there's an expectation that builds up. So while harassing the author should be discouraged, there's also some responsibility on the author's part to deliver what they got people hooked on. So, and we can debate that endlessly. Yeah. But, there's I did an interview with Patrick Rothfuss a couple of years ago. It's on the channel, and, I snipped out a part of that interview, and posted on YouTube where I asked him about book 3 of his series. And that is the most watched video on my YouTube channel and the most commented on. And they are 99% horrible comments. With people just really, really upset. As someone who delivers, on time, all of your books and ahead of time.
Yeah.
Most of the time, I'm not asking you to comment on them, but for you, what is the expectation like, on your part when you are working feverishly on a book, and delivering, ahead of time, but while still writing fantastic books that readers are loving? What is it about your process, that allows you to stay on schedule?
That's a good question.
That was a long and winding question. I apologize, but I was trying to be diplomatic.
Yeah. So I won't comment on specific individuals, but I know that some writers out there suffer from various mental health problems that causes them to have much greater anxiety than I've mentioned in my own kind of suddenly I can't write phase that I know comes up. So I don't have any of those issues is one thing. I take my job very, very seriously as a writer. It's not to get into the details, but it's my job and it pays the bills. I work part-time and I write part-time, but still being a writer pays for, keeps the lights on. So if I don't hand the book in on time, I don't get paid, which is what I kind of really need. So exactly. It's this weird combination because before I started writing, for 20 years before that, I've worked in business. So I've got a very kind of logical, structured business mind. And then at the same time, in parallel, I'd been writing and trying to get published, which is absolutely the opposite of it. It's pure creativity and free thought. So I've had these two balanced sides in my mind for a long time, so that when I eventually got published and they said, okay, you need to hand this book in by this time and this date, I started breaking it down into kind of segments. I said, right, I need to write this many words per day on average, and therefore I need to hit this many words on average per month. And I mean, some people don't like to do that. So there's, this is just what works for me. So I created an own system that, while logical, was also creative, because I knew that for those many hours per day, I needed to get, 1,000 words done or something, and maybe 20,000 words per month. And sticking to that as much as possible is how I was able to just get our words down. Because, some days we all have horrible days where, work is bad, or you're tired, or you're just feeling awful. And, I'd let myself have the day off, but the next day I get back on and I start writing. And of course, life gets in the way. There is lots of things going on. As I mentioned, other people have mental health problems. They have families. They have some people work full time and still manage to deliver their books. So there's a constant juggling act, even for me. But I think the pressures that some people feel are probably less. There's expectation from fans, but nowhere near the degree that some of the top authors have, where fans will literally harangue them anytime they come online or anytime they post about anything. The first question is, when's the next book coming out?
Right. And I think it probably perpetuates more of this problem, and them thinking they're pushing the author to deliver is actually making the problem worse.
Yeah. And the thing is, we all could name the top 5 probably authors in fantasy, and maybe 2 of them don't deliver their books on time, but there's still 99% of fantasy authors that do, and they produce the books, hand them in, deliver on time, and they're published on time. So I think it's more a case of people saying, so-and-so hasn't delivered their book. Okay, but maybe pick up something else off the shelf, and maybe you become a fan of that person and grow their fan base. So it's, some people just want to stick to what they know, which I think it's a bit sad for us new guys trying to get in there, and girls, trying to build an audience.
Right. How do you approach the balance between business and art? I know that you talked about that this is your job, and you have to deliver product on time, and to do that you have to meet a certain word count every day, and that's the old adage is put your butt in the chair, and that's what makes work come out. In keeping a mindset like that, how do you keep the story fresh and know that you're creating something that is dynamic and is, pushing boundaries and things like that, like you're known to do? How do you juggle those 2 aspects?
I think some of it comes from when I first start building the story and the world. I plan my books in fair detail. I have the beginning, the middle, the end. I have various milestones, but the creative part comes from me, from getting from one milestone to the next. I don't always know how it's going to happen. Sometimes I sit down in the morning and the words just come out. My brain has worked out what it's going to do whilst I was asleep. Other days I sit down at the keyboard and it just is a struggle, and I just have to kind of grind the words out. But there's always that thought in the back of my head saying, get the words done. You've got to hit your daily word count. You've got to, get it done so you can get your month count, so you can hand the book in. So it's a constant kind of battle between the voices. Plus, there's the other voice that says, oh, maybe you should go and do the vacuuming, and oh, maybe you could wash the car. How about cutting the grass? It's looking quite long, and anything to stop me sitting in the chair and doing the writing. So there's constant distractions that I have to train myself to ignore until I've done the words, and then go, right, now you can go and cut the grass. Okay.
Has your writing process changed since you began? How much of the story do you have worked out ahead of time so that when you sit down to write, you know what you're writing? How much planning goes in?
Yeah. So I'm wrapping up book 6, and I'm starting something new. I've made a fair few notes on what is in theory going to be a new trilogy. I made a lot of notes on the first book, broken it down into sections, and then bulleted out, not chapters, but main themes. But I've got like a paragraph for the second book and maybe 2 lines for the third book. So, but as I get towards the end of this brand new book, my mind will start turning to the new stuff, and I'll start making notes and adding to it and fleshing it out. So that process hasn't changed since the beginning, from when I first wrote Battle Mage. I always have a rough idea of where I'm going, but between books, things can definitely change. There's that thing of your original plan, and then the book that comes out can be a little different, not hugely because I plan stuff, but there's some things change, which then has a knock-on effect to the next book and the one after that. So it hasn't changed too much since I started. I guess I'm just more regimented now, because before I was working full-time and I was writing late into the night most nights and weekends, whereas now I still feel guilty when I give myself time off, because there's that voice saying, well, you should be writing. But there's the other part that says, you've hit your daily word count. Shut up. Just go and relax. So there's always that guilt there in the background.
Right. Stephen, I'm going to put a link to the last show that you were on in the show notes, so that people, if they haven't listened to that, they can go back and listen. But for the folks that haven't listened to that one yet, where did Battle Mage come from? What was the initial idea that you got for this really unique world, and kind of how did this whole series in this world get started for you?
Yeah, so I think it was shortly after one of my favorite authors died, an English fantasy author called David Gemmell, and huge fan of his books, absolutely wonderful guy. And he passed away. And so in a sort of homage to him, I wrote a short story about an old wizard going on a final quest. And this was kind of an homage also to his first book, Legend, about an old warrior called Druss. So I wrote this short story, didn't really do much with it, didn't show it to anybody. It was just kind of for me, and I put it away. And then I started work on another book. I was already writing novels at this point and trying to get published. And I tried, I think, a crime book, and then I did a horror book. But the short story was still in the back of my mind. And I started thinking, okay, so what did this old wizard do when he was younger? What happened to him? How did he get to this point? How did he survive? And it was from there that I started building up the story of the main character of all of the series, which is Balfrus. And I thought, okay, if I'm going to create a fantasy world, I'm going to put all of the things into it that I haven't seen of late. When I was creating this world, there was a lot of almost fantasy was slipped under the door. It was something that people seemed to be embarrassed about, that you'd get 200 pages in and then suddenly there's a dragon and you think, okay, that could have been anywhere. That could have been, England 400 years ago or 600 years ago, whatever. So I said, no, I want something up front. It's the fantastic. I want non-human races. I want magic, and I want weird stuff creeping around the corners. And from all of these different elements of what I wasn't seeing in other books, what I wanted to put in, and just lots of other ideas, I kind of created a melting pot and filtered it through and created Battle Mage.
How has your love of comics and superhero stories especially worked into your writing?
That's a good question. So I've been reading comics probably as long as I've been reading fantasy books. And they're connected in a way, because growing up I also read a lot of myths and legends books, whether it was Greek or Roman or Norse or Middle Eastern mythology. And all of these books feature larger-than-life characters with names that you know, and we still know to this day, and the great feats that they did. So really, they were the kind of archetypes of what later became superheroes, people that are stronger, faster, more powerful, that slay beasts and amazing creatures from outer space. And all of that fantastic stuff, whether it was from the comics or from the myths and legends, fed into me wanting to create characters that were equally resonant, that people would remember without them being stereotypes. So I wanted to take something that was familiar and twist it slightly, or take something from the comics that I'd seen and merge it with something from a fantasy book and create something a little bit different. So I built a world that was familiar and yet had lots of strange things that I hoped people hadn't seen before, like races that I created from my own. There's nothing wrong with elves and dwarves if you can do something new with them, but I thought, okay, I want to start with something completely different. And there again, in all of the comics I've been reading, you have alien races, and I took inspiration from some of those books.
Speaking of comics, we've talked about writing a long running series and the benefits to that, as well as some of the drawbacks of keeping a story going for across numerous books and things like that. Comics probably has the biggest of that problem, because you've got some characters that are 75 or more years old now. What do you think of the current comics climate, and do you think that these characters are still, that we're still telling engaging stories about them? And what do you think fiction, long form prose writers can take from the world of comics and that business model, I guess, more than anything?
So comics now have, it's strange. So the characters have never been more popular, Marvel and DC, for just sticking with those. Plus, there's there's lots of other publishers that now are engaging in other media. But if we're just talking about Marvel and DC, the characters themselves have never been more popular. But monthly comic sale numbers are nowhere near what they used to be, because technology and the internet has moved on so much now that you now get animated things of Marvel and DC characters. You've got live action TV shows with superheroes. I mean, we never dreamed of when I was growing up. We had, remember the hokey Captain America film? The Incredible Hulk with Lou Ferrigno, all of that stuff. That was as close as we got. And now you've got a CGI Hulk with Mark Ruffalo. You've got Iron Man. So people know these characters everywhere around the world, Batman, Superman, and so on. But if you ask 100 people who watch those films, how many of them actually read the comic books? I bet the number is probably less than 10 in 100, probably. They probably say, I watched the animated thing, or I've got the DVD of Captain America this, or Avengers that. But those who actually read the comics... So it's strange. Comics themselves are a fantastic and unique medium, and there's so many things you can do in them that you can't do with others. But at the same time, I think some people in Hollywood view them as cheap R&D.
Right.
Because you could pay the artist, the inker, the colorist, the letterer, the cover artist, and maybe put out a comic, let's just say for $10,000. Just pick a number at random. There's one issue of a comic, $10,000. You do 12 issues, $12,000. You can't produce anything in TV or film or animation for $12,000. You just can't. But if a comic book comes out and it's a 12-issue miniseries that is incredible, it's different, it's unique, and then someone goes, hey, I like that idea, let's use that. And then suddenly Christopher Nolan or Zack Snyder or Joss Whedon or someone takes a part of that idea and then they put it into a Batman or Avengers film. So I think in some ways fantasy novels are now catching up to this model in a way that they can't diversify in the same way. You still get some spin-off comics. You'll get, look at, Red Sonja and Conan comics that came from the novels, but very few properties that started in fantasy books have come to that level. You do get other things now. You're now starting to get more TV series and more films based on fantasy books. I would say partly because of the success of Lord of the Rings, and then of course Game of Thrones. Whether you like it or love it or watch it or not, that opens so many doorways, because suddenly people who don't read fantasy realized, oh wait, fantasy books can be really complicated and have grey characters and go in all sorts of weird places. And of course, Harry Potter, I shouldn't ignore that, because that's the fantastic too. So I think if fantasy is going to continue and do well, I would hope that more people who watch the TV shows and the films will go back and read the books, because they'll get a lot more out of it. But it hasn't worked for comics, but I don't know. I think it may work for novels.
Interesting. I've never thought of the studios using comics as an R&D division. That is a fantastic insight. I've never thought of that, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
Two cents worth. I think That's how some people will say, no, that's not true. The people who work at Marvel and DC Comics, all they're actually interested in is creating wonderful comics. That's their goal. And every month they put out amazing books with some of the best art I've seen in decades. And I love comics. I still read them as comics. But of course, I watch some of the TV shows and I love the films too. So I'm kind of got a foot in both places. But there are some people that out there will just say, we need a new idea for the new Superman film. What have you got? And of course, they're going to go back and look in the library and go, we've got this one where he lands in Russia and he's raised as so-and-so. Great. Let's do an animated thing. Red Sun. There you go. Done.
Red Sun, one of the most fantastic Elseworlds DC comics ever. If you've never read Red Sun, you need to go read it. It is amazing.
Or, here's a really old version of Logan in a desolate landscape from Old Man Logan. Right, we'll take that and change it slightly, and now we've got the fantastic film Logan that came out with Hugh Jackman and Patrick Stewart. Amazing. 12-issue run by Mark Millar. That's what it's based on, loosely.
Yeah, and I think that's been kind of been the bane of a lot of readers' experience with comics lately and with movies, is that, they're just going through the back catalog and then, bastardizing, some of the stories that we love. And maybe, but that's just the reality of it. And, if you're a comics fan, you just need to embrace that the mediums are different and that they are going to cherry pick what they want and manipulate it how they want. And, we just hope that we keep getting, I think we've been pretty lucky, so far with film adaptations of some of the stories that we love. We just hope it stays that way.
Yeah, because some things in the comics just won't work on film or TV. They have to change some of it. And of course, if you still love the original thing, it's still there. I mean, Watchmen is so divisive. I loved the book. I thought the film was okay. They changed the ending. It wasn't great. But the book is still there. So there's some part of me that gets a little bit annoyed sometimes, but I have to kind of stamp down on that voice because I don't own the book. It's not my property. But there's that kind of weird sense of ownership. But I don't then go onto social media and blast people. That way leads to madness, and that way leads to any time an author pops up, you go, where's the next book? And it just is a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it is. It is. Watchmen was kind of a weird thing because it was one of the first modern, and I'm not talking about the Tim Burton Batman era, the new modern, superhero, adaptations. And yes, they changed it and it was, hardcore fans were upset about some things. But it was really pretty and it kind of paved the way to say, this can be done and it can be done well. And I think you have to respect it at least on that level. That, Zack Snyder did something with something he loved and he put his spin on it. And, I think it really opened up some doors for stories like that.
Yeah. And it's like the TV show Smallville that ran for 10 years. And there again, that opened the door to show people and say, look, you can do superheroes on TV and it doesn't have to be hokey and it doesn't have to be silly and it can have emotional weight and be a drama as well as having a superhero stuff. And 10 years of that, and then after that we've had the brand new wave that's continued and is constantly growing, that I can't keep up now with the number of comic related TV shows. Someone will say, have you seen this? And my response more often than not now is, what? I haven't even heard of that show.
We actually have a young adult drama based on Archie comics right now.
Yeah.
I never imagined I would live in that world. I remember when my teenage kids, they had discovered, Riverdale on Netflix and were binge watching it.
Yeah.
And I walked in and I was like, that's Jughead Jones. And they said, what do you know about that? I was like, I don't know. I started reading Archie when I was 4. I don't know.
Maybe.
What do I know about, Archie and Jughead? And they just looked at me like I had 7 heads, but I was like, nothing is new under the sun. I think that was in the Bible somewhere. But, you host a podcast, also about comics and geek culture, which is one of the reasons I asked you.
Yeah.
Tell me about Grouchy Old Geeks.
So I've been podcasting for 11 years now.
Amazing.
me and my friend Scott started that long ago. It was there's a UK podcast called Geek Syndicate that had been going for a year. I'd been listening to, and back then, it sounds silly to say now, but it's true. There were perhaps maybe a few dozen podcasts, and that was about it. And in the UK, not very many at all. And this is one of the first geek-related podcasts that I'd heard from two British guys talking about it. And I thought, this is quite fun. I quite enjoy it. Maybe I should try doing something like this. So in 2007, me and a friend got together and we started recording. At the time, we were called Comic Book Outsiders because a lot of people were talking about all of the main things. And I read comics outside of Marvel and DC. And I thought, okay, I want to spotlight some of this other stuff that people aren't talking about. So we talked a lot about Image and Dark Horse and Top Shelf and all sorts of comics, as well as TV and film. And over the years,
fantastic stories coming out of those publishers.
Oh yeah. And I made some good friends and met some interesting people, interviewed some great people that have gone on to do all sorts of things. Like we interviewed a guy called Robert Venditti, who wrote a book called The Surrogates for Top Shelf, which of course has now been made into a film with Bruce Willis many years later. But, you know, we love the comic. We talked to him about the comic. Rob now works for DC Comics. He's just done a great run on Green Lantern, and he's currently working on Hawkman. So I met all sorts of great people, talked to great people. The podcast has never really stopped. I've done other podcasts in parallel. We moved network and we kind of joined with Geek Syndicate, and we became grouchy old geeks because we're embracing the fact that, as you said, we've seen it before. Something comes out. Yeah, I've seen it. I saw the original. I'm old enough to remember the original. And more often than not, I'm pretty set against reboots. 99% out of 100, I'm not interested. I'd rather go back. I mean, there are exceptions, and if they're good, I will say, that was really good. I really enjoyed it. That was wonderful, like Battlestar Galactica. But for every Battlestar, there's 50 terrible, terrible things that come out. So we grouch. We talk about comics and TV and films. And we just do that once a month. And after 11 years, we said if it ever stopped being fun, we'd stop doing it. So at the moment, I'm still having fun with it.
That's great. And it's such a great outlet when you're a creative person and you're creating stories and you get so deep in your own head. A lot of times it's, that's what this podcast does for me. A lot of times it allows me to focus on someone else. And to tell their story for a while. And there's really nothing like, just getting outside your own head for a while. And I love that podcasting opens that door.
Yeah. And it's long form because everyone's attention span seems to get shorter and shorter. It's all, clickbait headlines and articles are very short. You don't get a chance to actually discuss things in detail anymore. You can do it, with friends face to face, but online, you get, too long, didn't read and things like this. I just can't bear that kind of stuff. So I like having a discussion with my friend Scott because sometimes we disagree, but we can do it in a healthy fashion. He can say, okay, this is why I like it and these are the reasons. And I can present an opposite point of view and we still shake hands and walk away as friends at the end of the day. But you can't do that online. You just can't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in 140 characters and I guess now 280 characters.
Yeah.
You just can't get past the surface. And that's what a great conversation allows you to do is to get deeper to find where we actually agree on things.
It's interesting you're saying about getting outside your own head. So just last weekend, I went to an event and I ran a workshop for these other people that came along on fantasy world building. And I ran them through some various exercises and then they talked to everybody and explain what they'd done and why. And it was fascinating just to hear. It's that thing of they say, if you give 100 monkeys typewriters, eventually one of them would write Shakespeare. This was kind of the flip side of that. I gave them all a map and said, okay, create your own fantasy world and then tell me about it. Various questions I posed them and they'd create something. And then they all had the same map, but I had 12 people all telling me very different stories based on a very simple premise that I gave them. And it wasn't just useful for me. It was useful for the other people because they were looking around the room going, oh, I hadn't have thought of that. And that's an interesting way of looking at things. So they were constantly being surprised by other people, and I was as well. And so it's that great thing of, you can all love something and all start at the same place, but everyone's perspective is so unique that you come away with something different. And I love doing it.
We were talking right before we started recording about to get back to your current trilogy that is in the middle of publishing. That your books keep getting longer as the story is told.
Yeah.
And you said the sixth book that you're in edits now is almost probably 50% longer than maybe the books in the first trilogy.
It is at the moment. Yeah. I'm editing it down. So I think my books average about 120,000, 130-ish maybe. I've got the current book down to 150, but that's still long for me. I know some authors, we were saying, have 200,000 and that's average for them, or 300, and some of the biggest ones are 400,000. The likes of Brandon Sanderson with Oathbringer, I think, is 450,000. Patrick Rothfuss's books are really long. Brent Weeks, his latest trilogy, they're pretty weighty tomes.
Yeah.
But
and he cracks jokes about the last book on Facebook all the time. If you're not following Brent Weeks and following along with him breaking deadlines like a little kid running through a Red Rover line, it's really funny. It's really funny. He's definitely in on his own joke.
Oh yeah. But I've been working on this edit for 3 weeks now, and I'm getting to the end, but I'm crawling. I'm just on my knees. So the idea of trying to edit a 300,000 word book, that sounds terrifying, because you can't move away from it. You have to stay within the minutiae to understand who's doing this, what's happening, have I tied up that thread, what's going on. And because this is the last book in this world for the future, as far as we know, I have to tie up things from 6 books. So I'm constantly fact-checking myself and making notes and double-checking things. But they're relatively short books compared to some. So the idea of spending 2 or 3 months on an edit of a book, crawling along, word by word, that sounds terrifying.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. You mentioned earlier, before the first trilogy was published, that you had tried your hand writing in different genres, crime fiction, maybe, and horror, before settling on the story that really connected. We all read in a lot of different genres, and I talk about this a lot, that sometimes an author will get pigeonholed by their own success into writing one thing when he or she really loves all sorts of different things and would love the opportunity to write something different. But the reality of the business is, when you're successful in one thing, that's where people expect to find you.
Yeah.
What can you, and I know you're writing something different now, and I haven't asked you to divulge that, and I won't, but what do you do creatively to stay fresh and to indulge those other likes and desires while staying true to what you have committed to as a business person?
So I think you have to constantly feed your brain with good stuff in order to write. I think if you sat in a blank room, you might go crazy, and you might start having hallucinations. But I think you get more use from feeding your brain good stuff. So as well as watching all the superhero shows that we talked about and reading fantasy books, which I still do, I consume a lot of other things. So I read non-fiction books. I read books outside the fantasy and sci-fi genre. I like biographies of certain people. As well as reading superhero comics, I read lots of other types of comics. And all of this is constantly feeding my brain good material. If I ever want to do something outside writing fantasy, I write comics with a friend, and that can be in any genre. But going forward, if I want to do a novel in something, there's always the possibility of writing under a pseudonym, a pen name, which is something I might explore in the future. I can say that the new project I'm working on is fantasy again, but it's, as I said, it's a totally brand new world. So it's stretching me in ways that I haven't had before, that I may have come a little too comfortable in my current fantasy world. So fantasy now has so many subgenres. They keep inventing them. I can't keep up. I just have to kind of write the book that I want to write, and then they tell me what genre it is. So at the moment, I have no idea what this new project is going to be labeled as, but I just sort of think, okay, write the story in the way that you want to write, and they'll sort it out later. So I think it's a balance of writing what you love, but also constantly feeding your brain with lots of fresh and different material so you don't end up writing just whatever you're reading.
Well, the book 2 of the second trilogy, The Age of Dread, the book 2 is called Magefall. It's out everywhere now. It's in paperback. It's an audiobook. After I talked to you last year, I went back and got the audio of the first trilogy, and it is amazing. And it is a completely different experience. Sometimes it's difficult for me to get into fantasy audiobooks, especially some of the big sprawling ones, because I'll realize that I kind of checked out for 30 seconds. I'm like, oh, what just happened? They're wonderful reads, but not everything translates to audio, all the time. But your books absolutely do. There's lots of action. There's lots of, dynamic stuff going on. They're a fantastic, representation of fantasy and audio. So I just want to say that. But the new book, Magefall, is available audio and paperback. And I highly recommend it. Book 3, you're in deep edits on it. We'll see that. Is it going to be fall next year? Is that kind of when your books tend to come?
It's going to be July, I think, next year.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So that'd be a great beach read for the middle of summer.
Yeah. It's interesting to say about the audiobooks because I know the narrator is a guy called Matt Addis, and before he records every book, we have a quick Skype call and we talk through things. So
that's helpful.
Yeah, because the first time he approached me, he said, "Would you mind?" And I said, "No, of course." So we got onto Skype and we start talking, and he asked me about the countries and how do I see them and pronunciation, and then he creates like a set and says, "Okay, for this country, this is the kind of accent I'm going to do. What about pronunciation of character names?" So we go through that. And so I've now worked with him on by the end of it, it'll be 6 books and a novella. And Matt's a classically trained actor. When he's not doing audiobooks, he's on the stage as a theatre actor. So he's got this there again. He's got these lots of different balances, and he's able to bring some of that theatrical performance and that power and lots of different accents to my books. So I was really pleased when he was presented as one of the options. And I said, yeah, that guy, let's go with him.
Well, I've heard some authors that they had no interaction with their audiobook narrator, and then the book comes out, and there's all sorts of mispronunciations and stuff because the narrator had no input, so he just went with with his instinct, and I would think any collaboration on any level between the two it is only going to make the product better.
Oh yeah, I'm very pleased that he got in contact with me. So, and I chat to him on social media too. I told him I was editing some words out of the new book, and he said, "Don't edit too much. I get paid by the hour." I was like, "Don't worry, there'll be plenty for you to read. Don't you worry." He said, "Okay, that's good. That's good."
Oh, that's so funny. That is so funny. So funny. Well, the new book is on my Kindle and it's in my Audible app, ready to go. I know you guys are going to love this book. Steve, I'm a huge fan, and I'm glad to call you a friend. If people are just learning about you, and we're going to have a link to the previous episode in the show notes as well, and there's a link to Magefall in the show notes as well. But where can people find you? I know you have a lot on your website. Where can they find you?
Yeah, so the best place to get in contact with me is via my website, which is just stephen-aryan.com. I'm on Twitter under @SteveAryan. I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/Steve Aryan Writer. I'm on Goodreads, but I don't tend to be on there very much. I just kind of post whatever I'm reading and the odd short review. So probably Facebook and Twitter or email me through my website is the best way to get a hold of me.
Excellent. Steve, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
My pleasure, Hank. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
He led Jason to a small bistro. The door set tiny bells to chime as they entered. The place shivered with smells. Coffee, hot chocolate, and croissants. "This," he said, extending his arm towards a woman in an apron, "is Jennifer. She makes the best scones and is tragically spoken for." He kissed the woman's hand. She was plump, in her 50s. She had left one curler to dangle at the back of her head this morning. "If it's a tragedy to you, this is the first I've heard of it." She swatted at him with a menu. "Why didn't you speak up 20 years ago, lady killer?" Jason sat. Jennifer put a glass of water in front of him. "And who is this fine gentleman?" "This," said Hedwig, joining, "is my son's great-grandfather's great-great-nephew." "That's a lot of greats. Any great-great-great-whatever of Hedwig is great by me." She giggled at her own wit. "I'll be back for your orders." Hedwig swatted her rear end with a menu as she left. He made small talk about the bistro, the specials, what was good, the Benedict, or not so, the hanger steak. When their orders came, coffee for both, eggs for Jason, a scone for himself, he got down to business. "I met your grandmother about, a year ago. Valerie and I have a mutual interest in old families, particularly old families related to the legend for obvious reasons. Valerie's lived in Tarrytown for years, though her family's up near Boston. Now don't worry, I don't believe all that nonsense about a headless horseman. Valerie's the superstitious one, but the Van Brunts are definitely the family in Irving's story. Hermanus Van Brunt and his wife Agatha were farmers in the village back in 1780 or so. This was during the Revolution. Hermanus grabbed title to lands left by a Tory family who'd been tarred and feathered and shipped back to Britain. Do you know your history?" "Sure. Tory. Loyal to the king. Benjamin Franklin broke with his own son who was a Tory." "Smart boy." "Traitors to the cause. And that was serious business. The British marched straight through here during the war, chased George Washington off Manhattan and out to New Jersey. And after they were kicked out again, a lot of Tories were kicked out with them. Anyway, the Van Brunts took over some farmland north of Tarrytown. They had a son, Abraham. And, of course, their son Abraham married a wealthy heiress. Katrina Van Tassel. Yes, all that is true. It's public record, just like the legend says. My mother left behind quite a few documents written by Abraham Van Brunt, Brom, in Dutch mostly. He was powerful around here. With Katrina's money, he became the biggest stone merchant in the state. He died in 1850. After him, it's Dylan Van Brunt, his son Joseph, the grandson, then Cornelius, then... Sorry, genealogy is not my thing. No? Why was Eliza doing research on the Van Brunts? She wasn't. She was looking into the Cranes. That's what made us such fast friends. I don't get it. We do go back a ways, your family and mine. More coffee? Jennifer appeared at Jason's elbow. Hedwig nodded and she poured. Still not getting it, said Jason. But he did. Hedwig turned to the waitress, and Jason knew what he would say. My lady, may I present? He raised his coffee cup, proclaiming, the last descendant of Ichabod Crane.